Mm. Okay, it's preparing the live stream now.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And do you mind helping me admit the folks wondering? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining this evening. Really excited for our second night in our South Queens Women's March Mentorships panel. Tonight we have our government and nonprofit sector here, and really excited to have wonderful speakers here. I'm going to go down the row and give everyone an opportunity to introduce themselves, get a little bit of background before we jump into tonight's session. So going across the board, I have Dedunu. Do you want to get a little brief overview about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Dedunu Suraweera. I am the Community School Director with SAYA, South Asian Youth Action, and I work specifically at the Richmond Hill High School site, and I support the site with a variety of after-school programs, post-secondary, college and career programming, mental health programming, and other community resources in the school. Thank you.
Okay, yes, glad to have you. Next, Fayola, if you give us a little background about yourself as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Fayola Fair. I use she, they pronouns. I am a high school global history educator at a public high school in the Lower East Side. And I'm also the creator and curator of the Reading for Black Lives Project, a mutual aid project to provide free books by Black, Indigenous, and POC authors to Black, Indigenous, and POC communities across NYC and beyond.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, Priam.
Hi, my name is Priam Saywack. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Deputy Director of the Tenants Rights Coalition at Queens Legal Services. I'm sure I'll end up talking a lot more about my job, but essentially what I do is supervise attorneys and paralegals, and we do a combination of eviction defense work and also affirmative litigation to help tenants combat harassment from their landlords, seek repairs, basically tenant-led actions against landlords to secure their rights and to stave off gentrification.
Nice, thank you. And Elizabeth, a little bit about you as well.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Persaud. I'm the Associate Director of Programs for Virtual Enterprises, VE. We're a program that offers a program to schools, middle schools and high schools across the country, helping students learn how to do business by doing business. So similar to Dedunu, we offer post-secondary resources and everything that a student would need to be successful for whatever endeavors they decide to pursue after high school or after middle school. And I'm excited to be here, and thank you to the South Queens panel for organizing this.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. And we'll be going through various discussion questions, but anyone who's on our Zoom as well on Facebook, we encourage you to send in any questions that you may have, and we'll get our panelists to answer any of your questions. So to get started, and we can go through the same listing that we had before. So what inspired you to pursue a career in whether the government or nonprofit sector in schooling? What really inspired you to get started on that? So we can start with Dedunu.
Yeah, so I feel like I have always been connected with schools or youth work, even when I was in school as a teenager, working with other nonprofits and doing like camp counseling, and just finding that over the years, I just always seemed to be connected in some way. So it felt like sort of a natural path to just continue in the nonprofit and government sector.
Nice. What about you, Fayola?
I remember being in high school and I absolutely like loved mock trial. And so I was like, oh, I'm gonna be a lawyer when I grow up. It's gonna be awesome, be working and creating change. And then I interned with the Supreme Court Justice and I was like, oh, I actually am not a huge fan of this. So after that, I kind of pivoted the next summer. I worked at a teacher education program in Boston, and I absolutely loved it. Just working with youth, kind of teaching. I taught English at the time, but my major in college was sociology and policy studies. So I eventually ended up pivoting into history education. But my mom is an educator, and I just really remember growing up. I'm from South Jamaica, but I never went to school in South Jamaica. And my mom was always saying, like, schools in our area don't have the best opportunities. And like as a child, you hear that, you don't really know what that means. And then as I got older, especially studying sociology and really thinking about the history of anti-Blackness, the history of classism, of racism in Queens that has led to the systematic devaluing of education and other social resources in communities like South Queens, like Jamaica Queens. Let me really think about the role that I could play in my community, like as an educator, and thinking about the importance of education in providing opportunity and kind of addressing dynamics that marginalize students of color. And so I kind of thought like education is one of the few fields where if you do your job right, you're not making someone else money, you're actually supporting and uplifting the next generation. So that means a lot to me. So yes, how I ended up as a teacher.
Nice. I understand that. What about you, Priam?
So like Fayola, I studied sociology in college at Fordham. I always just knew I wanted a career helping people. For a while, I thought I wanted to be a social worker. To be honest, I know this is sort of like a trope about immigrant parents, but they were kind of pushing me to be either a doctor or a lawyer. However, in this case, it was true. Not to generalize, but in this case, it was true. So I definitely preferred law to medicine. I decided to go to law school, but I still knew that I wanted a career in helping people. So I knew I wanted to do something in the nonprofit sector. I was thinking family law or immigration law, but I ended up getting an internship doing housing law, specifically eviction defense. So, going to court with lawyers, defending tenants in non-payment and holdover proceedings. And I ended up loving it. And here I am. I mean, it wasn't that automatic, but I've worked at my organization, Queens Legal Services, for the past 9 years and have moved from being a staff attorney to a supervising attorney to a deputy director. And I feel as though in my job, it actually has a very heavy social work aspect. I'm talking to people every day and helping them with their issues just in a different way.
Oh, makes sense. And what about you, Elizabeth?
I think similar to what everyone else has said, it's a good thing and bad thing being last. But part of it goes back to my high school experience at Richmond Hill High School. A lot of the clubs that I was involved in and the community work that we did really shaped my passion towards working in nonprofit. I originally started with the assumption that I would go into accounting because I really like math and I was a math tutor, and I was like, this is the easy path. But once I had my first internship in an accounting firm, I realized I hated it, it wasn't for me. It wasn't a good fit for me. And that I wanted to have that collaborative aspect of being able to work with like-minded individuals and being part of an organization where you could see that tangible impact, whether it's on students or in your environment, in your community. And a lot of that, like I mentioned, goes back to community projects that I did in high school, everything from helping to revitalize parks to helping students with their homework after school. I realized that those were the experiences that I truly enjoyed and that I got a deep sense of satisfaction from. And I feel like that's what really led me towards wanting a career in nonprofit. And also coming full circle back to VE because I was also a student in the program when it was offered at Richmond Hill High School. So a lot of that, like memories from my teenage days, really helped to shape that.
Nice. No, it makes sense. And I know that we kind of touched on it in this last question, but can you share about your educational background and how that helped you prepare for your career today? And we could stay in the same path, Dedunu.
Sure. So yeah, I I got my bachelor's in psychology at Stony Brook, my master's in social work at Columbia University. And I guess like, you know, when I started doing psychology, I was really interested in it. But I found that, you know, I always wanted to work with young people or in a youth or educational setting. But I felt like psychology was limiting for me. And so I, you know, pursued social work as a master's, you know, with the intention of really looking for tools and guides to support the whole community and thinking about, you know, what are all the other socioeconomic and, you know, political factors, right, that affect individuals and communities. And in some ways, you know, it did prepare me in terms of having paid internships, particularly during my master's, being able to work in, you know, youth settings or other settings to apply the skills I was learning in social work. In other ways, I would think of like what are maybe non-traditional educational pathways versus like the work that I did on my own through teaching artistry or community organizing. And I found that that's really been a really helpful tool for me in the work I do every day. As a nonprofit that works inside a school, I'm constantly working with so many different systems and layers and bureaucracies, and organizing really taught me the way to strategize on working with different parties and entities and being just as strategic as intentional as I can to, you know, do bring as much integrity as I can to the work. So in some ways, you know, maybe like my university teachings maybe offered some theories, helped me get connected with different networks, and provided maybe a few tools around like data. But in other ways, it was like that real everyday work in organizing and teaching artistry that also really informs my work every day, managing different programs.
No, I hear you. And what about you, Fayola?
So I studied sociology and policy studies at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. I then took a year and I did a year service with City Year, where I worked as like a teaching assistant in a public school in Long Island City. And then from there, that kind of solidified my decision to go to graduate school. I ended up going to Teachers College at Columbia University and studying the teaching of social studies. And so I think that I love the fact that I didn't study history in undergrad, because that sociological perspective really allows me to understand the variety of forces that impact education in New York City. Again, thinking about race, thinking about class, and thinking about histories like redlining and segregation and how that continues to play a role in the experiences of students of color in every single public school and any educational institution in New York City. So kind of really having that larger perspective of education is something that I keep with me every day when I'm teaching. So whenever I'm feeling like really frustrated, it makes me think like, you know, the number of my students who, for example, are not eating breakfast before they come to school. It's really like, even for me as an adult, it's hard to focus when I'm not eating. Students who don't necessarily have access to healthcare. So like, if you can't see the board, you know, it's hard to stay engaged. If you don't have Wi-Fi at home, how can I expect you to go home and, you know, do this research for homework and come back in on the next day and like be prepared to share? So just really being more conscientious of the variety of factors that impact my work as an educator is something that I really, really appreciate, something that I'm always keeping in mind, allowing for me to advocate for my students inside the classroom and outside. Yeah.
Thank you. And what about you, Priam?
Yeah, so I talked about my educational background a bit in the previous, when answering the previous question, but I guess I'll elaborate a little bit. So, you know, when I went into college, I knew I wanted to help people, but I wasn't really entirely sure what that meant in terms of a career path. Like Fayola, actually, I think that studying sociology really, really gave me a perspective of what is happening with the world and structural inequality and issues that I could feel, but I just didn't have names for them and I didn't know the terms, and just studying that just really gave me a deeper understanding of everything that really affects us all, right? And even today, I think that my degree, my undergraduate degree, is very helpful when, working with clients, but not only just working with clients, but as a supervisor and in a more managerial role where I'm kind of starting to have some say in what our organization is doing in terms of our mission, in terms of how we're choosing the cases we take. I think having that sociological background and just always being cognizant of structural racism, structural inequality, it helps me serve my clients better, and it helps me, shape the work that I do better. And then, going to law school, I think, to be honest, if I actually had been a social worker, at least in a traditional, maybe clinical setting, I think I maybe would have been miserable because, sometimes, and this isn't, I find it hard sometimes to just listen to people tell me about everything, that's happening in their lives, right? But as a lawyer, of course, social workers help it. And as a lawyer, I help in a different way. Some things can't be helped, but at least like maybe I could get this one case dismissed. So I actually really ended up liking taking the career path in law versus social work, even though what I wanted to do initially was be a social worker, or at least in college, that's what I wanted to be.
Makes sense. And what about you, Alyssa?
So I studied international business at Pace University for undergrad, and then I got my master's in public admin from Baruch. And I do have to attribute a lot of what I know now to even my high school experience, even though it was way back ago, to VE, not just because I worked there, but also because it shaped part of who I am now as a professional, learning different business skills. But with my degrees in particular, I feel like for international business, that really helped me to develop the umbrella sort of core skills that I needed for various job functions, whichever career that I decided to go into. There were like classes, like as we've all experienced before, where I'm like, I'm not even sure if I'll ever use this ever again, but chances are it will come up in your work. For example, like one of the classes that I had to take in undergrad was accounting, and we were learning how to read financial statements. And now, like years later, I'm reading balance sheets as part of like my work for working with our board of directors. So there's always some place or time where those certain skills will apply. With my master's in public administration, similar to what I think Priam was saying, it really helped me to understand like what exactly is a policy, like how do you read it? What does all of this data mean that we always see on like TV and in ads, and how is that used to inform those policies? So I think my educational background really helped to inform those decisions, but also the way that I am as a professional. So everything from taking like a business communication class, learning how to write an email, like all of those skills eventually filtered into what I do now, and what I, use with the students who we work with in the program.
That makes sense. And so what was your first job in the field, and how has that helped you in your professional growth thus far? And we could continue the route here. So Dedunu.
Sure. So my first job was in teaching artistry. And I worked in different schools, doing a variety of things, sometimes working on a particular theme that maybe was requested by the school to work on with students around different social issues or topics. Sometimes working on stories that students would share about themselves anonymously, and then we would turn them into skits to raise awareness about what was maybe happening in the school. And so it was a different path, or it was really more directly focused working one-on-one with students and in an arts-based kind of setting. But it taught me so much just about finding ways like to remind myself how I can continue to stay connected and remind myself of the stories, the lived experiences that our students are facing every day. which informs me today around, how do I better manage or develop programs. It means also coming back to our students and hearing from them, hearing their feedback. And I'm fortunate to be in a setting as a nonprofit through our initiative at SIA. It's something called the Community School Initiative. It's a city initiative. And SIA is what's called a lead CBO, a lead community-based organization. We partner with the school to provide different services. And so, one of the things that I always remind myself is like, how can I always make sure that I'm still making that one-on-one time with students? And I think back to those days as a teaching artist when I got to work one-on-one with them and hear from them. So I still think about that for sure.
Good, good. What about you, Fayola?
So being a high school teacher is actually my first job in this field, my first full-time job actually. And so it's definitely been a bit of a learning curve, from things as simple as like applying to health insurance to just, oh wow, like you don't graduate from your job, you just keep going every year. And so I'm kind of getting used to that. I think in regards to that, especially becoming a teacher quote unquote post-COVID. So I went to graduate school in 2020. I found out February of 2020 I got into Columbia, and I was like, oh, like this COVID thing is gonna go, it'll be over soon. I'll be in person. The first time we were all in person was my graduation. I did student teaching on Zoom and all of that. And so kind of transitioning into being in the classroom was really difficult in the sense that there were, as we know, just with like remote learning and things like that, and just like lack of support from the government in supporting our communities and supporting students and being successful with remote learning. It's definitely been kind of a huge learning curve for me. But I think one thing that's really for me has been leaning into is kind of like empathy. I remember going to graduate school on Zoom, and I just remember how difficult it was to be paying attention in class, but like thinking about my family and like thinking about my community and thinking about all the impacts of COVID and doing that as an adult. And just thinking about like my students who are going through very similar things. Like I remember I had one during student teaching. I student taught at two different schools, at a high school and a middle school. And I remember I was student teaching at the middle school, and one of the students like, oh, you student teach in my sister's class. I was like, oh, like, how do you know that? And she basically said that they do school together all day in the same room. So they notice me on each other's screens. So even thinking about like, wow, even for me, like I'm an adult, I'm in a room by myself, I'm on Zoom, I'm still getting distracted. You're literally hearing your siblings all taking class at the same time in the same room on the same Wi-Fi network. And so kind of that really impacted me, and just thinking about how all of these systems are so interconnected, and thinking about when we think about schools, like they really are, we are impacted by so many things outside of our control, but they show up in our classrooms every single day. And so it's definitely been difficult in the sense of kind of adjusting to that as my first full-time job. But it's I've learned and grown in so many different ways. And so excited to see where I go next in regards to thinking about future career paths.
Nice. Oh. And what about you, Priam?
Yeah, so I have worked at the same organization for the past 9 years. Wow, actually November 10th makes 9 years. So I was an intern there, but after that, I started off as a staff attorney, and doing eviction defense work. Ultimately, I had a caseload of about 40 cases. Now I'm a deputy director, like I said, so I supervise a team of 5 attorneys and a paralegal. Just on a very practical level, I don't think I could be an efficient supervisor without having actually done the work myself. I think the only way you learn a legal field, a particular practice area, is by doing it. But just on another level, I just feel like this is true of very many jobs. In the nonprofit sector specifically, though, I think as you get promoted and you move up the ladder, so to speak, sometimes you're just not interacting with clients as much. And you really kind of have to remind yourself what it is you're doing and why you're here, because, it starts to become about numbers and you have a grant and you're supposed to serve this many people per year and then fulfilling grant requirements. So just having the background with individual clients and hearing their stories and working on their individual cases, I just don't think I could approach my work with the same level of empathy if I hadn't done that for years before moving into management.
Right. And then you, Elizabeth?
So my first job in the nonprofit field was for Older Adults Technology Services, now bought by AARP, which is a very familiar name. And in that company, I was an intern. The mission of the organization was to help older adults across the country learn technology to better their lives. So everything from how to use a mouse and how to use a keyboard to some of them were developing websites. They were entrepreneurs ready to start their businesses. So a lot of that informed who I am today. Everything from being in the office, I think as an intern helped to develop my professional presence, some of my mannerisms and certain business etiquette that I had, like starting that internship at such a young age. I think I was at around like 20 or 21 years old when I started, like just being in that environment. Like I was fortunate enough to be able to go into the office in between classes. It was right in the city. It was a couple of train stops away, and just learning through observation. So learning the way that people would deliver trainings, or learning the way that people would conduct meetings, and even getting to like listen in on board meetings that were happening, I feel like was really important. Another part of that contributed to my professional development, I think, was the opportunity to get exposed to all of these different organizations and connections, especially being a nonprofit. There are a number of times where we would attend like different fairs and get to meet council people who we only read about, but then when you actually meet them, it's like, wow, this person is real. Especially for me, when I was at that age, it was always like seeing them on the news or hearing about the policies that they would pass through, but getting to be able to meet them and to interact with them, I think was totally a game changer, especially within that particular role that I did. And because of that, I was able to also advance in that organization up to a training manager position. But yeah, I feel like just being in that in-person environment versus, like, I know a lot of people now start off their jobs as remote, really helped to define who I was as a professional.
That makes sense. Okay, we can switch up the order. So I'm going to start with Elizabeth first on this next question. So could you describe a challenging moment in your career and how did you overcome that?
So a challenging moment for me was changing jobs. So switching from Oates to VE, where I'm working now. It took me about a year to actually come to the decision that I actually wanted to switch careers. And for me, the way that I sort of handled that whole situation was, one, I'm very much a person who likes to make a pros and cons list. So I started thinking about, all right, for me personally, what are the pros of me staying here? What are the cons? It was one of those situations where I was ready to move on professionally. I felt like there were other areas for me to grow. And for the organization, I felt like that there were a lot of changes that were happening that I wasn't ready for at that time. So having the pros and cons and being able to have conversations with mentors and those who are close in my network, I feel really helped me to overcome those challenges surrounded with changing a job. Being able to talk to like my sister and mentors and professors who I had close relationships with, and asking them like, what's your advice? Like, do you think this is the right decision I'm making? And also just being able to take a step back and thinking about your own career path, realizing that I was in that job for 5 years, maybe it is time for change. For some people, it may be different, but I think it also, goes back to looking at the bigger picture and thinking about what's right for me at that point.
And what about you, Priya?
I'm gonna go back. I mean, to be frank, there are a lot of challenging moments in my career, but I'm gonna go back to very early in my career, before I was even an admitted attorney, to one of my first clients. So this client just was she had a lot of things wrong with her apartment, and she actually lived in NYCHA housing, which, if you're familiar with their developments, are are really, really horrible. She was also being harassed by building management. They weren't crediting rent payments. So she was just very, very frustrated with everything, that was happening. And she was not happy to learn that her case was assigned to somebody who was a brand new attorney. Frankly, I wasn't even an attorney yet. I was a law graduate. I wasn't admitted. So she complained very loudly about that to both me and my supervisor, saying that why would you assign my case to somebody who doesn't know what they're doing? She wasn't necessarily very pleasant, but it's very understandable given all of the frustrations she was dealing with, given all of the systems and the infrastructure that she was dealing with. She just felt like everything was against her. But eventually, I dedicated a lot of time to her case. I remember sitting in my office once with her for 5 hours, going over a huge bag of rent receipts. And ultimately, she ended up saying that she really liked me and that she could tell that I was going to go on to have a successful career. We didn't fully win the case. It was sort of a mixed result, but she was able to get her repairs done ultimately. And we got along, we ended up getting along really well. She's actually, well, unfortunately, frankly, she's still facing issues with housing. And now an attorney I supervise has her case, but we have a great rapport now. And she actually, this makes me smile a little bit, but she said that I became a supervisor because I had her case. So maybe I did. Who knows?
Stepping stones there, yes. What about you, Fayola?
A recent kind of challenge I faced was actually this last year. This is my third year teaching. So my first year, I had a co-teacher. Essentially I teach an ICT class, which is a class where we have two teachers in the classroom supporting students with IEPs, or students who have like learning disabilities and particular learning needs. And so my first year, my ICT teacher, she was my mentor, and we were just like very close. She's a woman of color. She's been teaching for like 20 something years, which is a little weird because I was like 23 at the time. She'd been teaching for like 25 years. And I was like, oh, wow. Wow. Okay. But we have a really, really, really strong bond, and I learned a lot from her, and it was a really, really productive relationship. I feel like, especially in the beginning, she really took on a lot of work, so I could kind of focus on more particular aspects of teaching. Like she would do a lot of the grading, so I could focus on lesson planning, or she would take on lesson planning, so I could take on, student outreach and things like that. And then my second year, I had a different co-teacher who was new to the school, a white woman, and we just had like a lot of very different perspectives. There's a lot of times like I didn't really feel heard. I didn't really feel supported. I remember asking her, I was like, hey, like, I need more support. This is only my second year teaching. And I remember her telling me, she's like, oh, wow, like, Fayola, I just completely forgot it's only your second year. And it's like, well, I ask you all the time for help. And so you telling me that I'm seem competent doesn't actually address the fact that I need help. And it actually, instead, it almost seems like you're trying to like, it's almost like the opposite of infantilizing. It's like, oh, like you're just so capable, you can just do it yourself. I just really wasn't feeling supported. My students weren't feeling supported. And I really just had to take the time to reach out to my department head, reaching out to the assistant principal, just asking and advocating for myself and saying that this isn't working for me. It's not working for my students. This isn't how I envision a co-teaching relationship. And I cannot do this again. And so thankfully in that advocacy for myself, now I'm back with my original co-teacher. And I feel like I'm in a coaching relationship where I'm really able to be at my best. My students are able to be at their best. And that we have like very shared kind of views and understanding of like our roles in the classroom. And so just be able to stick up for myself and to advocate for myself, and in saying that, like, it might be uncomfortable, but having to say that because at the end of the day, like, it was either I was going to be uncomfortable, or she was going to be uncomfortable. And why would I sit here and swallow my discomfort for somebody else? So.
Understandable. And what about you, Dedunu?
Yeah. So many challenges, as folks have mentioned. I definitely resonate with the school challenges there. I guess one that comes up is during quarantine. Probably about a week before, we had just hired 3 new people to the team, and it was actually like that week of like March 2020 that the schools decided to shut down. And I was like, oh my God, I just hired 3 new people. How am I going to shift all of their work remotely? Like, I'm still trying to figure out what their roles are. So I was like really just, anxious about it, and trying to figure out how to make it work. But it took really just doing kind of like a needs assessment again, to find out, okay, what are the needs of our students, of our families, and that meant literally calling, like one-on-one, like having caseloads, calling students and families, every single one of them, asking them, what's coming up for you, how can we support you, reaching out to teachers and guidance counselors, to know what was going on their end, checking in with the new staff and asking them, what their comfort level was in working virtually, and finding out how to match those pieces, is like, what are the strengths or areas of growth they wanted to kind of work through virtually? How does it match what the needs are within our programming? What are the new needs that maybe we haven't seen before that are coming up? It was definitely, a really difficult time, because it really took intentional one-on-one outreach to so many different people multiple times. But we were able to get through it. And I think what was nice to see was sort of seeing like students being able to share more about themselves that maybe I hadn't before, like, creating art online, or them being able to share their voices online, in a way that maybe they didn't before. Sometimes we would have to go like to a student's home to drop off like resources, food, things like that. And that actually connected us even more with families that we might have not been connected with before. So it did take a lot, but we were able to get through it, and definitely learned a lot, post quarantine, kind of how to better be more intentional in the work that we're doing with our students and families.
Understand that. Yeah. And then starting back with Elizabeth, can you tell me about a memorable achievement or project in your career that you're really proud of?
Definitely. So when I was working with older adults technology services, I helped to manage a team of around 20 trainers, part-time trainers who worked across the country. And something that I considered like my Bible at that time was a training manual that I took the lead on putting together with our staff members for the trainers to basically train the trainer at that time. This was around, I want to say like 2015. So in this case, in this organization, the resources were living in so many different places. Like people would check the portal for one thing, or have a paper copy of this, and go to the front desk and get this. So being able to consolidate all of that information into something that was then standardized and cohesive was a really great personal accomplishment for me, being able to know that we were able to consolidate a lot of information and make it easily accessible for a growing staff. Eventually, we started using it to train trainers until our staff grew to about double the size. And it was great to see that impact, right? Like knowing that these trainers, varying from like college level age students all the way to seniors over the age of 60, could use this one resource to be able to become a technology trainer and teach these skills to other people. So I always think back to that project because it was a real collaborative effort. Like it involved a lot of moving pieces. It was almost like a big puzzle. Different departments, working with the CEO all the way down to the interns, gathering as much information that you can, and being able to keep it concise, but also in a way that was accessible to everyone who would be using it. So far, I want to say that's one of my favorite accomplishments of my career.
Nice. What about you, Priam?
So I was I went from being a staff attorney to a supervisory attorney to a deputy director, but I was kind of thrown into my current position because somebody was let go. And, whenever somebody is let go, it's sort of a bit of a mess because I didn't have somebody telling me exactly where things stood, just in terms of the work that, the unit was doing, because the unit I'm in now is a bit more focused on affirmative litigation. So bringing cases on behalf of tenant associations, bringing cases on behalf of buildings. And I had no idea what tenant associations we were working with, what buildings we were working on. There wasn't a master list anywhere. We also work with a variety of community-based organizations. I didn't know who we were working on with. I didn't have a list of the contacts. Additionally, I was promoted at the very beginning of 2022. So it was sort of during that period of transitioning out of COVID a little bit. And, with some of our work with CBOs and going to buildings and things like that, it was also put on pause because of COVID, because, staff wasn't being sent out to tenant meetings, and we weren't meeting in person with the CBO. So a lot of those relationships had become weaker because of the pandemic. So yeah, I just feel really good about being able to build up the practice again and establish new relationships with different CBOs. And we started doing clinics with Woodside on the Move and this other CBO called Asian Americans for Equality. So just establishing new relationships with new CBOs and with tenant associations, and starting cases in new buildings without necessarily having the most information to start with.
Understand. What about you, Fayola?
Something I'm really proud of. So last year, and this year as well, I was the co-advisor of our school's Gender Sexuality Alliance. And so we actually went on our first out of state trip. So we went on a trip to Salem, Massachusetts during Pride Month. And it took a lot of work and a lot of time and effort and energy to kind of put that trip together and coordinate it. But to this day, like almost a year later, students are still like talking about that trip with such like excitement, something new that they were able to do. And it's just really, really awesome and really dope. And it just makes me think about like, yes, like when I'm teaching, I'm like, okay, we have this lesson to get through and we need to work on this project, we need to do this and the third. But being able to make space for getting to know our youth and to support our youth outside of just academics was really, really beautiful. And it was just a lot of fun.
Hey, nice. And Dedunu?
Yeah, so similar to Priam, I came into a situation where not came into, but there was a part of like not too far into me just starting in my role as a site director. The person that was currently community school director was soon no longer part of the organization, and so yes, it was unexpected. And so it's just figuring out, okay, how do I, jump into this new role? And it was definitely, it was challenging. But yeah, when I think back to kind of, a memorable achievement, I think when we first started, we were a team of maybe 3 or 4. We had maybe like one space in a classroom and a few clubs, maybe one person helping out with college and career post-secondary support, and now we're a team of about 15 plus folks. We have a whole wellness center, which used to be just an office. We have a lot of different like special initiatives that we work on, just really being intentional about, cultural affinity groups, ways to embed culturally responsive education in our work, not just in our clubs, but across all of our different, our mentorship programming, our post-secondary work. So I feel, like when I think back, I was like, oh my God, it was like so much, and I couldn't really imagine how could I take on this role. But it, having a lot of help from mentors, from other folks in the school, folks within SIA, with help, we're at a better place now, so that feels good.
Good. All right, so next question is, how do you balance your personal values and beliefs with the goals and missions of the organization or schools that you're a part of? And Elizabeth, we'll go with you again.
So that's a great question. I like that you asked this one too. In balancing your personal values and beliefs, I feel like a lot of it has to go back to that empathy piece. So being able to empathize, whether it's with the population that you're serving or with the people who you're working with. For me, I was fortunate enough to have that personal connection with VE all the way from my experience as a student up until now, and knowing the impact that it had on me. So for VE in particular, when I was a student, I had the opportunity to go to places I never got to before, especially as the child of immigrant parents. I wasn't able to go out after school, but with these programs, I was able to experience buildings like Deloitte and Ernst & Young in the city and get all dressed up and like learn from professionals. And I feel like being able to relate to the students who we serve now, knowing that we're able to give them those opportunities, knowing that they're facing similar challenges and that they may or may not have access to the resources like VE might have. So knowing that there's a real tangible impact there, I think is important. And I think that goes back to, the values and personal beliefs. Like at the end of the day, how does it align to really like what your goals are, what motivates you? How do you think you would be affected by this if you were in that person's role? I think are all very important.
Yep, I definitely agree. What about you, Priam? Oh, you're on mute.
I did this yesterday too. I can't believe it. Anyway, yeah, so I mean, I would say that, at least the stated goals of my organization are aligned with my personal values and beliefs. That said, though, right, sometimes even though the mission statement may be something I can stand behind, in practice, the way the nonprofit is functioning isn't necessarily, the best way to serve clients. I just think, for example, and this is actually above the level of my individual nonprofit, right? But the way we receive funding is through a government agency, and the government agency has reporting requirements, and we're supposed to serve a certain number of tenants. And, it's just, I guess that isn't specifically against my values, having any sort of metric, but viewing people as numbers is certainly against my values, especially people who are in very, very difficult circumstances. So, I think though, sometimes I just have to admit to myself that even though the goal is ultimately structural change, that direct legal services and directly helping folks is important too. And if we have to function within that system for now, that's okay, while still trying to change these systems and the way our work is measured. I also sometimes feel like that, frankly, just like on the broadest level, right, being an attorney, period, right, because housing is treated as a commodity, but I think housing should be a human right. I don't necessarily think, okay, maybe I'm okay with like somebody paying for a mansion theoretically, right? But I think everybody should have safe and decent housing, whether or not they can afford to pay an exorbitant amount of rent, right? But I'm functioning within a system where that is, where it's, you have to pay rent to live somewhere. So kind of balancing the fact that I don't believe in the system at all, but I'm still working with it, within it, is something I deal with. But then again, right, if I just think of it in terms of my clients' lives are better because, or, our organization's clients' lives are better because we're serving them, even though we're not fixing the entire system. every single day, even though that's what we're working towards, it's hard not to feel like a cog in the machine sometimes. I have to admit.
I definitely understand. And what about you, Fayola?
Just finessing it where I can. I teach at a public school, but I teach at a consortium school. So students don't have to take the regents. So I have a lot of freedom in what I teach and like how I teach. So that was like really important for me, being a product of the public school system and kind of going back as a teacher. Something I was really aware of how confining and constraining teaching to a test can be. I think just constantly like speaking the truth and speaking truth to power. There are a lot of situations in my school where I'm like, that's really problematic. Like that's racist or that's sexist or like that's homophobic, and just constantly naming that and saying that, even though it might make me look like a problem, but constantly speaking that, and also finding people to validate your truth, to validate your reality. And so knowing like, no, I'm not the only person that notices it. This is an issue that other people are noticing as well. It's not just me. And I think just really centering my students' experiences. So when students are talking to me, like, yeah, the way this teacher talks to me, like, it doesn't make me feel good. I feel talked down to, and not being like, oh, well, like, they didn't mean it like that. Like, I'm sure they meant, but like actually listening to them and hearing them and validating them. I think especially again, like with the dissonance of going to starting the year after COVID ended, quote unquote, and just hearing like teachers are so important and education is so important, and hearing that, but then seeing schools being defunded this year, seeing libraries being defunded this year, seeing the NYPD receive millions of dollars in an increase in budget, and recognizing, what I'm being told, but what the actual reality is, and in regards to funding, in the regard that schools and teachers are regarded, are completely different. And so constantly noting those contradictions, and being aware of them, and really making sure that, yes, people might say a great big deal, but where are the actions? And with schools, like, where's the money? So constantly thinking about those things and being aware of those things, and just not allowing myself to be gaslit. So I think a lot of, and I also just kind of think like, if I wasn't, like, I'm there for my students, like if I wasn't there, my students would still be there, and they would still be dealing with these dynamics, with like one less advocate. So that's something I think about, but I'm also trying to find that balance of like recognizing that and advocating for my students, but not also allowing myself to be a punching bag for racism, or a punching bag and kind of ignoring my own needs. So I'm still trying to figure out that balance. If anyone has any advice on that, that'd be appreciated, but that's where I'm at.
Understand. What about you, Dedunu?
Yeah, I can resonate a lot with what Fayola was saying. Just working in a school, you're dealing with so many different things and so many systems. I particularly also work in the DOE in a traditional public school system, which I always describe as archaic, because of the history that we're learning, the things that we're celebrating, the rules that are there, just feels so just not in touch with our communities and what they need, in touch with time. And it's, the reality is that like it is always centering white cis heteronormative standards, and so also able-bodied folks. And so like it's really it's frustrating a lot of times, especially as a nonprofit, a CBO in a school. So it's like I'm always trying to balance what is the mission, the goals of my organization, the mission, the goals of my school, of the DOE, of the Office of Community Schools, and ultimately myself. And then I also manage a team of like 15 plus folks who we might think that we all have similar values, but oftentimes, right, it's not always aligned. And even if they are, we have different ideas of how to execute those value, like that value, right, that framework. So the challenge for me is always like, okay, what is it that like I can keep and hold to myself and keep my integrity, while also like being real to what the needs of my team are, my students, our families, right? Our communities, it's really, really tough. I would say like every day can feel like, you know, there's always going to be something that comes up. It can feel like a battle. And there's also a part of me that I need to like protect for myself to like be able to move through and navigate each day. And so I try to remind myself of like, what can I control and what can I not control? And that's really hard because sometimes I'm like, I think I can't do this. And so I try to think about with the things that I value, if I want to address something that's happening in the school, I ask for it and they say, no, you can't do it. Is there another route? What's the other solution? Okay, I can't do a workshop here. Can I do a one-on-one here? Maybe I'm going to do it in a lunchtime session. Maybe instead of working with this group, I'm going to work with that group. And so I'm always trying to think about like with those values, how can I execute what it is that's happening in my head? And also making sure that those values align with the needs of our students and families, right? So always coming back to like, well, maybe this is my value, but is this actually in line with what they are voicing that they need? And making sure that that uplifts, you know, we're holding space and uplifting that space for students to be able to share in a safer way, whether it's that one-on-one, whether it's a lunchtime session, whether it's, you know, a workshop. And yeah, it can be really tough. So I definitely also seek that advice as well. It's an ongoing journey for sure.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I'm going to go back to you, Dedunu. So, how do you stay motivated and committed just to kind of face through whatever challenges that you're dealing with in your line of work?
Yeah. So I think one part is, yeah, I know I just said this, but I think being able to connect with students directly is important for me, specifically because in my role, there's several different programs that I have to manage that become really administrative focused. And sometimes I don't get that time to really see students as much. So making sure that I can have that moment, like today was, for instance, I had so many administrative duties, but I had this one period where I was able to talk to a student. And that just sort of reset for me because it reminds me and grounds me like, why am I in this? Because the system sometimes can take me in a place of like, this is hard. How can I keep going? But that's really important to me. And then I've also thought about like, are there supports both within my workplace and outside of my workplace that I can reach out to? I'm fortunate to have really supportive supervisors that I consider mentors to me that really help me in this work. And it helps being a nonprofit in a way in a school because I can step out of the school and be able to talk to other colleagues in my CBO, as well as just other friends in, you know, the education network, hearing from them, sharing best practices, hearing how they get through it is really helpful for me.
And what about you, Fayola?
So I think for me, kind of echoing Deduna's answer, just like remembering like why I'm here. And for me, it's my students. I realize when I think about the frustrations of teaching, like it's never my students, it's always the like adults. It's like, dang, at your big age, it's how you act. I'm sorry, but that's I think about that like at least 10 times a day. At least like, you know, a 14, 15-year-old, I'm like, yeah, like you're 14 years old. Like I understand why you act like that. 30, 40 years old, I'd be like, okay, that's a little different. But yeah, I think just maybe I'm doing it for my students. They're like the next generation and they're growing up in unprecedented times. I feel like history repeats itself and so many things that we're dealing with are so similar to the past, but so many things are so different. And I just remember kind of learning about the atrocities of the past as a child, and now thinking about children who are actively witnessing the atrocities of our current society, thinking what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Tigray, and so many other parts of the world, and just kind of growing up in a society where, you know, you're witnessing these things on your cell phone, and as a child, you might not know what to do, or you might not have any sense of like control in the society. And so how does the work that I do help support students in kind of moving through these things, even though I am as an adult also figuring out how to move through these things. Taking breaks and taking time for myself. Like one thing I really love to do is read. I love books. And so I have like a book bulletin in my classroom that I update every month with different topics. This past month was like spooky season, so things connected to like Halloween and stuff like that. I think this was my birthday month, so this upcoming month I might do like my favorite books of all time. But it's like finding small ways to find joy, taking time to laugh with my students, to actually talk to them and have conversations with them like as people, and remembering the fact that like my life is more than my work. My life is more than my job. We weren't just put on here to work 24/7. We were put in here to have like beautiful connections with other people, with the environment, with the world around us. So how do I make time to do that every day? Going on walks and putting my phone down and like taking out my earbuds and just like listening to the world around me are things that I try to do, and finding joy and trying to find balance. And also in community, talking to other people who are doing similar work, doing difficult work, under difficult circumstances. And so remembering that I'm not alone and remembering that none of us have to have all the answers. There's many, many people who came before us and many people who will come after us. So how can we work together in community with one another, instead of feeling like we have to be the only person doing it, or the one person or the first person to do it, but how can we be doing it together?
Great. What about you, Priam?
Yeah, I'm just gonna sort of piggyback off of what Dedunu and Fayola said. Sorry, I had to like look at the pronunciation. I want to make sure I was pronouncing it right. I want to piggyback off of what they both said though, which is just remembering why I got into this work in the first place. I think that is really the primary thing, because I think I get so bogged down in administrative tasks, in making sure the cases are closed properly and this form was uploaded and this report was complete. But obviously, well, maybe not obviously, maybe some people really enjoy that stuff, but that is not why I got into this work. So just reminding myself every day about the clients that we serve, about the landlord harassment, about them forcing tenants out of their apartments, about what we're really doing. I think that's how I stay motivated. And also, of course, self-care and not working all the time. And, it's kind of difficult to shut off my phone sometimes, especially because in this field, there are actual emergencies, but just remembering not everything is an actual emergency. And even in a field where, people are, landlords do lock folks out, the majority of things are in emergencies, even still.
That makes sense. And Elizabeth?
Just echoing what my fellow panelists said, going back to work-life balance, being able to have that time for yourself, knowing when to close the computer when it's time to end work for the day, but also having a strong network of mentors that you could lean on just to talk things through, just to vent to sometimes it's needed, is important. But also wanted to like fully emphasize being able to have those relationships and interactions with the populations who we serve. I think draws it back to staying motivated and committed. For example, a couple weeks ago, I visited a classroom where the students were entirely unmotivated. Most of them had their AirPods in, they were just on their phones. The school was very poorly resourced. The teacher was getting ready to leave for medical leave. They had no one to cover for her. The smart board wasn't working. The Wi-Fi was down. Like there were so many issues. And none of it was, of course, the students' fault. They just happened to be put in that situation where it was so poorly resourced, they weren't even able to access certain parts of the curriculum. So from there, we invited them to a leadership conference that we held on Long Island a couple weeks ago, where that group of students got to network and meet other students from all of the other schools across the Long Island region, and some New York City schools as well. And in those interactions, they learned that there were other teenagers like them out there who had very like-minded interests, who wanted to go into business, who wanted to start their own companies, and who were passionate about things that they were passionate about, and who were serious about like wanting to do the program that they had in their high school, where they're learning everything from creating an employee handbook to learning how to pay their payroll. Like it all became very real for them in that moment. So a couple weeks later, when we went back to the classroom and visited, it was an entirely different experience. So all of the chairs were turned around facing towards the front. They were taking notes. They were excited to show us like their website that they had just created, and the marketing students were excited to show us like the flyers that they had just put together. So just being able to see that tangible sort of impact really made it pay off, especially like considering all of the long nights and Zoom calls and emails and prep that had to go into planning the event. At times it got very, very stressful. But after the event was over, like being able to take a step back and say like, wow, this is the impact that we had on these students, I think goes back to staying motivated, just being able to see that impact. And of course, self-care when there's time for it.
Yes,
Or
absolutely.
making time for it.
So Dedunu, what skills would you believe are essential or really important to be successful in your line of work?
Yeah, so one of the terms that I still think about that came from social work school is having a strengths-based framework. And so what that means to me is really being able to recognize that when we're working with different communities, we're coming from a place of recognizing the strengths, recognizing that communities do have agency and power, and we are just here to help hold the space for them to utilize the power they already have. That's really important because I think a lot of times, like, you can come into this work and find that like you think you know what's right for a community, even if you're from that community, and then realize when you're working with them that actually there's like a whole other set of needs that you might not have any idea about. And I say that like as a South Asian who, you know, born and raised in Staten Island, I work with a lot of South Asian folks in Richmond Hill, totally different set of needs than the South Asians that I grew up in Staten Island, right? And so I think it's really important to not have that like savior mindset. You know, you're not coming in to save people. You have to be really honest with yourself about why is it that you're going into this work? How are you going to bring integrity, humility, and understanding, and coming from a place of like, actually, I'm not going to know all the time. Like, communities are also going to tell me and educate me about how I can also be better at supporting them with the power and privilege I might hold structurally to support them with those needs. So I'd say that's important. And one other thing I would say is just also setting boundaries, being able to work on in this field, you're always going to be like, there's so much going on, and being able to build that skill set and actually being able to say, no, I can't do this, or I don't think this is right. And that is going to be hard, especially when it comes to your values. But it is something I think is like a muscle that you got to work on in your journey.
This makes sense. What about you, Fayola? Sorry.
I think one thing for me is asking questions, and just staying curious. Like as a historian, constantly questioning and constantly thinking and supporting my students in asking really strong questions and asking, you know, whose voices are we hearing from? Whose voices are we not? Whose perspective is this from? Whose perspective is being ignored? Why is it being presented this way? Like what message is it sending, and what's the impact of that message? So constantly being able to ask questions. And then I think on the flip side for me as an educator of like being open to asking my students questions. I think a lot of times teaching is really about just forming connection and forming relationships with students. And I think it can be, especially the ways in which school can be so traumatic for many students. And so for me, even though I'm like, oh, look, I'm different, like I'm new and I'm fresh and I'm hip and I'm trying to be helpful. But if you've been going through school, like, you know, you're in 9th or 10th grade, you have 9 or 10 years of experience in school, and who knows what those experiences have been. And so really being open and remembering that I technically am, I am an op. Like I think one of my students or something, my mom asked me, she's like, Fayola, what's an op? She's a teacher too. And I had to think, I was like, yeah, teachers are technically ops, right? That's kind of the function of our job. And so how do I support my students and build relationships where they recognize the fact that, okay, you know, anything that Fayola does is for my safety and for my well-being. I'm not trying to surveil students and things like that. But it really makes me think about like asking questions. So instead of being like, oh, you need to turn your homework in, like this is why you're failing, it's like, well, why aren't you turning your homework in? Or, you know, like, why are you on your phone right now? And like actually getting to the root of the problem instead of identifying the student as that problem, really trying to figure out, you know, what's the underlying issue and how can we address that? And how can I support my students in recognizing that and addressing that? So yeah, really just asking questions.
That makes sense. What about you, Priam?
Nicole, I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question? I just want to make sure I'm answering the
Oh,
right thing.
yes. So skills that are going to be helpful for success in your career.
Yeah, so I think the number one skill is definitely empathy. Just, you know, it's kind of goes back to the previous question, but like just remembering why I'm here. And I think without empathy, I couldn't do my job effectively because I wouldn't be serving the clients in the way that they need to be served, and I wouldn't be working with them. Also, you know, I'm using the term serve, but really I view it as a collaborative relationship. So also I think just being able to collaborate with people on different levels, well, not levels, I don't want to use the word levels, but just collaborate with, you know, your colleagues, collaborate with CBOs, collaborate with clients. I wouldn't say collaborate with court staff because, you know, I kind of, you know, they're part of a racist system, right? But working well with court staff, I would say, just being able to have relationships that aren't trying to take power dynamics out of relationships as much as possible. But at the same time, also, frankly, being able to delegate, you know, I view my relationship with the people I supervise as collaborative, but at the same time, delegating tasks and not trying to do everything myself because that's helpful to no one. It's not helpful to me, but it also just isn't the best way to do the work or help anyone. So yeah, I would say empathy and collaborating effectively. And just a last one, I think this isn't limited to the nonprofit sector, but just time management. And I don't like using the term prioritizing because, you know, it's really difficult when you're dealing with people's lives, right? You're dealing with people's homes and them potentially being evicted, right? So I hate using the term prioritizing, but there does still have to be, you know, a list of things you're doing that day and some sort of, you know, methodical nature to what you're doing, or else nothing, you're not going to be able to help anyone.
Elizabeth?
I think, in my opinion, adaptability. We all saw a prime example of this in 2020 when the pandemic occurred. And especially for the school system, like it was something we'd never experienced before, right? Like students were starting to work in an online format. Like, what did that mean? Where were they going to get devices from? Like, how would they be able to access Wi-Fi to get to the online lessons? So many factors there. And with many nonprofits, I always like to say that you wear many hats. There's always going to be different responsibilities and projects that you're assigned to, which is good because you get that diverse view of the different functions of the organization. But at the same time, it goes back to what I'm trying not to use the word prioritize, but going back to like time management and thinking about what's most important to being successful. But yeah, I really do believe adaptability is important, especially in those settings and being able to pivot. So when the pandemic happened, fortunately, we have a curriculum that's entirely virtual. The barrier that we faced was students didn't have access to the technology that they needed at home in order to access the curriculum. So it turned into thinking about ways that we could provide it either via paper, or if there was a way that we could connect like once a week, whether it was over a Zoom call. There were so many different things that had to happen in a very short amount of time to accommodate to that. Luckily, we had a little bit of buffer during that summer to prepare ourselves for 2021, where things were still kind of online, but almost getting back to normal, but not quite there yet. But as an organization, we had to, you know, make a decision on what we ultimately wanted to do, like what was our stance then. I think it also goes back to, I think Priam was mentioning, like sometimes, especially with nonprofits, you get all of these different grant proposals, and they all have their different needs and different deliverables that are expected of the organization. So I think being able to adapt, but also pivot so that you're trying to fulfill the needs of the grant, but also staying close to the mission of your organization, I think is very important. But it's equally as important to be able to adapt to those changes, because a lot of the drivers behind those grants are usually to keep up with industry trends, to support the students, whether it's through fiscal resources or through offering like office space for students to work from. So thinking about that. And the second part of that, equally as important skills, would be communication and transparency, especially in a nonprofit, because so many different people are doing so many things. And because things are always changing, we're always rapidly keeping up with those changes, just being able to communicate that in a timely and clear process, like with your peers, especially from the top down level. Like if there are decisions being made at the C-suite level, like how are they being communicated and how fast are they being communicated to the rest of the staff? So definitely wanted to highlight adaptability, transparency, and communication for a nonprofit, and education in particular, since that's my background.
Makes sense. Okay, so next question is, what advice would you give someone who's considering a career in the government or nonprofit sector? And we could start with Dedunu again.
Yeah, so I think if you're considering a career, I'll speak more to the youth nonprofit sector slash school. I think, you know, this work is very much you have to like, or I shouldn't say you have to, but passion comes out so much in this work, and for so many folks about, you know, their drive to be involved in education or connect with young people and families. So being clear with your own intention is really important. Like, why do you want to work in school? Why do you want to work with young people? Be really specific with yourself first about what is that reason. And I would say, you know, if there's opportunities to take, to volunteer, to take paid internships, try to get a paid internship, because yeah, precarious work can lead to other challenges. It's really important to just get your feet wet in the opportunity to be involved in the sector. I know for me, once I got that opportunity in different paid internships working with different youth nonprofits, it definitely opened up a whole new lens for me. I would say also connecting with finding maybe, or connecting with other mentors, other folks that are interested in your field. You'll find that like people that maybe you've gone to school with, or that you've met through your school network or through your paid internship are people that you can also build something together with, or you might find an opportunity there. So think about, you know, who's around you. And also take advantage of the fact that we are in a big city like New York, where there are just so many different ways to connect with nonprofits and the government sector. So sign up for listservs, you know, attend sessions like this, right, that South Queens is hosting. Stay connected with all, you know, different events through different listservs or social media groups or things like that, because that can also be an opportunity to connect. And the last thing I would say is, echoing a lot of what my colleagues have said before, is bringing, you know, empathy to your work, that sense of adaptability, and recognizing that you are going to be in a field that relies a lot on funding cycles. And so a lot of that is going to coincide maybe with your own initial vision or frame in which you want to do something. And so you're going to have to reconcile with that in some way. And so understanding that, you know, funding cycles do affect how we do things. But a friend once said to me also that being limited can also help foster creativity. And so think about ways that you can also stay creative, even when everything just feels like it's so tight. And I would also recommend reading this book. It's called Beyond, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. It was published in 2007, but I highly recommend it if you want to understand the cycles of funding in nonprofits.
Awesome. Thank you. What about you, Fayola?
I think my main piece of advice would be to really interrogate why you want to become a teacher. If it's to save people, then that is not a great reason to become a teacher, because you're kind of externalizing. And I feel like a lot of the work of a teacher is like very internal, constantly reflecting, constantly thinking about the way that I behave in the classroom and like what my actions, like what message will send to students. And so if you're kind of going in with a very external, like, oh, I'm here to save these children, then you're really not doing the work that you need to do in order to be an effective teacher. And to be completely honest, me personally, I feel like to the extent you're doing more damage than anything. And so I think that's one piece of advice that I have. I think another piece of advice is just constantly just being aware of the contradictions, being told like, wow, thank you so much for your work as a teacher. And then you're turning around and you're defunding schools or, continuing to make teachers work for less and less pay. One thing, they recently cut our procession budget, which is money that goes towards outside of the classroom activities. So, for example, office hours, me staying after school in order to support students, they've cut money for that. But they're still telling us to do office hours, just don't get paid for it. So just being really aware of the contradictions, and what contradictions can you live with and what can't you, and how can you finesse the system to ensure that, you're not completely being exploited. So there's that. Besides that, I honestly, it's only my third year, so I'm still figuring things out. I'm still learning, I'm still growing. But I think definitely taking time to reflect, to journal, and also remembering a lot of times, like, it's not you. I think there's so many times where like I'm teaching a class and then like kids have their heads down. I'm just like, am I like being boring? Like, I'm so sorry. I genuinely do not mean to bore you. Like, I thought this would be an exciting lesson, and remembering like, did they get enough sleep last night? Like, did they have a really big lunch? If they had a really long day. So remembering that things aren't always about you and not to take things personally is really helpful. And start thinking about yourself when you were in high school. I was real awkward in high school. And I don't know, I had a really hard time in high school to some extent. And so just keeping that in mind and keeping the empathy in mind for my students and remembering that they're just trying to figure it out themselves. And we're all trying to figure it out. That's the best that we can do. Yeah.
Great, thank you. What about you, Priam?
Yeah, so I think just to the extent possible, speaking to people who are already in the field. So, I thought this isn't really specific to, me working in a nonprofit, but in college, I was part of our pre-law society. So that kind of prepared me for law school. And then in law school, though, I did internships in a variety of practice areas. And I think that was helpful, just to see how the organizations worked to a certain extent, because as an intern, you're not going to fully see everything, which is why I also suggest you just, to the extent possible, talking to folks who are already working in the field, because, you think that, you may have these ambitions of, this is what the work is going to look like. I'm going to be going to court. I'm going to be representing these tenants. And that is a big part of the work, but a big part of the work is also just a lot of doing grant stuff. It's a lot of, maybe not being able to choose your own cases. Some places have heavier caseloads than others too. And, as much as I hate saying that you want a manageable caseload, you do want a manageable caseload, because if your caseload isn't manageable, you're not actually, helping anyone, right? Or maybe you're helping a little bit, but if you have too many cases and you're overwhelmed, you're not actually representing the clients to the extent, as well as they should be represented. And sometimes it can actually hurt to have an attorney who isn't attentive, hurt more than representing somebody, hurt more than just representing themselves, right? So, and you certainly don't want to do that. So you kind of also want to do research on the organization you're joining. And the best way to do research is by talking to folks, because this is certainly not going to be on their website, right? So that their caseloads are unmanageable, for example.
Makes sense. And then Elizabeth?
I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. I was going to piggyback off of that. My first piece of advice was around doing that research, especially as it pertains to working in a nonprofit. Usually when I mention that I'm in the nonprofit field, the first impression that many have is that, all right, you work in a nonprofit, you probably don't make much money. So it goes back to the fact that you should be able to research the organizations that you're interested in, whether it's through looking at videos of the work that they did online, looking at their annual report, I think is very important. There you get an idea of like what the company's budget is, like if they're profitable, how much are they impacting the populations that they serve, looking at the company's website. I know for many nonprofits, a lot of their like tax information is also public information as well, if that's something that is also of value to you. So definitely do your research is my first point of advice. The second is around, I think the work-life balance as well. So depending on where you work and the people who you serve, it's very easy to take that work home. Like there are different situations where it might be sort of like a taxing situation, or maybe one of the students you're working with had a very like challenging day and they like expressed that to you and vented to you, and part of you wants to take that home and just like start to unpack that and figure out like how can I help this student. But there has to be a line, right? There has to be a line between being able to empathize with that student and support them in whatever way you can, but also being able to not try to entirely take it home, so that you're also, you know, living with that challenge yourself. So I think the work-life balance is important, and being able to say no, especially in nonprofit work, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of different hats that you'll have to wear, especially if you're a smaller nonprofit with limited funding. There's going to be a lot of times where it's like, all right, we need you to do this because you're short-staffed. And I'm guilty of only recently in my career, I've learned how to say, and I've felt more empowered to say no, but it's important because at some point you also need to be able to draw that line and set those boundaries, because you know what you're capable of. You're the best person who does know that. And it's important to show like in order for me to effectively like do my job and do my role, like this is what I can manage at that time. But definitely echoing what everyone else said too around the work-life balance and everything else, I think was important.
Great. I know we're running almost close to time, but I do have one question for all of you. I'd love to know, what are some things you're excited about for your future and your career aspirations? And we can go back around with Dedunu and with Elizabeth.
So I really do love the organization that I work with, Saya. I've been with them coming up on my 8th year. And so I'm excited to support Saya in moving in additional directions. I work in Richmond Hill, but I'm excited to support in other program pieces within Saya. I really care about its mission, and I was thinking about how, I've worked in many different nonprofits before Saya, and so I feel really fortunate that a goal of mine is to help build Saya. So if you can find that within a nonprofit and you feel like connected to that, then stick with that, because it's not easy to find. Like it might take some time, and I'm not saying that that's what you need to do, because that's not what I'm saying. But if that's something that you're finding yourself, you're seeking, then consider exploring that or doing your research, right? So I'm excited to continue building and working with Saya.
Nice. What about you, Fayola? Fayola?
Oh, sorry. I got confused by the word. I've been thinking a lot about other ways I can engage in education without necessarily being in the classroom. I think that I do really love teaching, but being a teacher is not just like teaching. There's so many other things that come with that. And just trying to find like more of a balance. So one thing I'm really excited of exploring, there's this program for classroom teachers to become librarians. I think especially with like the current attacks on libraries and like the funding of libraries, I'm really curious to learn more about the work that I could do as a librarian. So that's something I'm excited to apply to, potentially going back to graduate school and getting another master's in information and library sciences.
Nice. What about you, Priam?
Yeah, so this is like more of a personal goal than a personal career goal than a goal for my organization. But I've just always wanted to work on some sort of federal litigation because that's just something I have never done before. So some sort of federal impact litigation. Yeah, that's a goal of mine.
Nice. And lastly, Elizabeth.
I'm very excited about the ever-changing but also advancing scope of education, especially with the current like industry trends that emerge, everything from like all of the new emerging technologies like ChatGPT and using AI and different technologies and being able to embed that in like the curriculums that we're starting to use in the schools and finding the tools that the students could use. For example, there's one called Grow with Google where it's like an actual live chatbot where they could practice interview questions and the chatbot gives them responses. So I think being able to attend like PD sessions and workshops and just learning about that information is what I'm really looking forward to, and being able to help implement those in the programs for the students that we serve.
Right. Nice. Well, thank you all. Honestly, I really enjoyed tonight's conversation. I personally learned a lot, and I know that a lot of everyone on this call and listening in as well. So I really appreciate the time. Honestly, grateful and thankful for all the work that you're doing in all in your respective organizations. And always happy to have you back. But thank you to everyone who joined as well, and participating in this conversation. And tomorrow we are going to be continuing this conversation for our medicine and science sector. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.